welcome back to Polymath. My name is Dan, and today I want to ask you, what do you want? And obviously that's a very individual answer, but there are certain innate, universal desires which we all have. So for example, we all want to be liked, respected, and thought of highly. To use a psychology term, this is our social status. And even if your internal monologue doesn't use the term social status, we think about this a lot. We're hardwired to think about this a lot. We also spend lots of time thinking about sex, romance, and attractiveness. We're also wired to want to be seen as attractive. So this is all obvious to us. What's not obvious to us is how we get these things. So essentially, people want a guide to their behavior. They want to learn what gives social status and what gives attractiveness. You probably think this too. Everyone's social status and attractiveness. We just need advice on how to get there. So let's look at the view nice guys finish last. You might have heard this view. You might believe this view yourself. What this is essentially a guide to behavior on how to achieve social status and be seen as attractive. So it's the idea that as a heterosexual man, in order to gain these things, being socially dominant, outcompeting others, being traditionally masculine, and reinforcing dominance with aggression is how you get ahead in life. So in order to have social status and be seen as attractive by women, all these things, especially social dominance, is necessary. Niceness, on the other hand, is equated with social submissiveness. So people who are nice, as a result of being socially subordinate, get exploited by other men, are seen as unattractive by women, and are generally disrespected and viewed with contempt. So this explains the sort of typology of alpha versus beta males. There's dominant men and there's subordinate men, which are equated to nice men. And this is a view that we find in various subcultures. For example, the manosphere, which I talked about on Polymath episode 23, pickup artist culture, and various male-dominated spaces online. And these influencers expound this ideology, this idea of the need for traditional masculinity and social dominance as a code of behavior, as a way of being respected and getting women. And this is often very rapidly absorbed by people within these spaces. And many people within these spaces tend to be male teenagers or other groups of men who are quite vulnerable in other ways. And when I say vulnerable, I mean people who are in urgent need of some kind of guide to behavior. So for example, as a teenager, due to biological reasons, because the emotional side of your brain develops faster in adolescence than the rational side of your brain, there's this very acutely felt need for social status. But they're not taught anything in school about how to achieve it. School doesn't say anything about how to live. It provides no guides for behavior. It addresses none of the psychological needs of the people there. So people go through this experience and they desperately want to be liked. They want to be respected. They want to be seen as cool. They want to be attractive to women. And not only teenage men, many men all want this to different extents. And they go online because of it. And when they go online influencers fill this gap. And they necessarily instill, but they try to instill, or rather they preach this ideology. So the idea of nice guys finish last, and I haven't commented at all so far on whether that ideology is true or not. The key thing to understand here is that this is an ideology. It's a code of behavior. It's a worldview. So the phrase nice guys finish last is very much the opposite of a throwaway phrase. For a lot of people, it's the guiding principle of their behavior. Now, this is a very politically charged subject. But because social status and attractiveness are scientific concepts, we don't need to look at this politically at all. We can look at this purely from a scientific perspective. We can survey the scientific evidence on social status and perceptions of attractiveness to say, is this belief system true? So that's what I want to do in this episode. I don't want to give you an agenda. I don't want to give you my opinions or any form of bias. I just want to relay the evidence to you. So firstly, what actually is niceness? Let's define niceness as doing things for the benefit of other people without gaining any benefit in return. That obviously, in a worldview which talks explicitly about niceness, the definition of niceness might itself be political, but I feel as if that's a reasonable definition which most people can agree on. So in evolutionary parlance, that is the definition of altruism. Altruism in evolutionary studies is doing things for the benefit of others without a benefit in return. And I mention evolution because ultimately, if we want to get right down to the heart of the issue, social status and attractiveness and dominance and altruism are all things that's evolved. And human nature is the product of evolution. So we need to look at evolution really. If we really want to understand this worldview, if we want to look at the science behind this and either prove it right or wrong or anywhere in the middle, ultimately we need to turn to evolution. So evolution is not a caring force. Evolution does not select for happiness or justice or morality. Evolution purely selects for what works. It purely selects for what leads to individuals passing on their genes to the next generation. So the fact that altruism, the idea of doing stuff for the benefit of others without any benefit in return, or even in the phrase nice guys finish last, in that phrase, that worldview implies that there are such people out there as nice guys. But that has evolved. And evolution is an uncaring force which only selects for what works. So this raises, in fact, a massive evolutionary question. If evolution is in fact survival of the fittest, why does altruism exist? This is a massive evolutionary puzzle. And it's because, in fact, altruism is evolutionarily adaptive. Altruism is a way of getting human beings to work together, either in pairs in the form of reciprocal altruism, i.e. you do me a favor now, I do you a favor later, or it's just a general mechanism for getting human beings to work together in a group, because human beings cannot survive as individuals. Human beings evolve to work in groups. All this psychological machinery around desiring social status and wanting to be attractive to others, that all relates about how you are perceived within your group of people, or within a or any group of people. But the point is, human beings are group animals. And human beings, so social dominance is a variable in human behavior. People are dominant or not dominant. That is a variable that does exist. But unlike animals, our social lives aren't defined by this variable of social dominance. Group cooperation, the way that groups function, isn't defined by this in the same way that animals' lives are. So often the influences in the manosphere, or these male-dominated spheres which espouse this worldview, point to chimpanzees. And they say, well, look at chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are our closest living relatives, although in reality our closest living relatives are both chimpanzees and bonobos, but that's not the point. But so they say, look at chimpanzees. In chimpanzees, social status is entirely the function of dominance. The way that chimpanzees are hierarchized is by method of dominance, and you really don't want to be at the bottom of a chimpanzee hierarchy. And that is true. But the obvious fact to mention here is that chimpanzees are nearly extinct. Chimpanzees do not cooperate with each other. They are constantly vying for dominance. Chimpanzees are nearly gone. They've nearly been erased from the earth. Human beings, the ones doing the extinguishing, actually work in quite a different way. It's because human beings work meaningfully as a group that as a species, we've managed to dominate the planet. And the way that evolution has gotten us to do that, obviously evolution isn't a conscious force, but the psychological machinery that's caused us to do that is very, very clever. The idea of social status as a concept, the reason why we want to be thought of highly by others, that's a mechanism, that's an evolutionary adaptation to get us to work together in groups, right? You can sort of see the logic in that. Human beings, in order for human beings to work in a group, we have to be concerned to some degree about what other members in the group think of us. However, in order to make that productive, in order to harness that human drive for social status towards the propagation of the group, the way and this has been validated by lots of scientific evidence, the way that human beings gain social status is by prosociality. And prosociality is a concept in psychology and sociology and anthropology, and essentially means doing things for the benefit of the group. It involves essentially building relations with other people, acting harmoniously and in concert with other people, and working together, doing things for the benefit of the group rather than aggrandizing yourself as an individual. So for example, if you're like a band player, let's say, the way that you gain social status, i.e. respect in the band, is by turning up to practice, being good at playing the instrument, encouraging others. All of that is for the benefit of the remainder of your group, but it gives you social status. So it's a really, really clever mechanism by evolution to align your interests with those of the group. And I've used a band as an example because that's really obvious, but this applies to everything, any group of people. It could be a band, or like a hobby group, an interest group, an institutional group such as an army or a police force, a citizenry in general, a social group like a group of friends. This is a general rule of human behavior. Prosociality is a means to counteract aggression. Chimpanzees don't really have much prosociality. They're very aggressive to each other. As a result, they don't really work too well together. As a result, they're nearly dead. Obviously, human dominance over chimpanzees is due to other factors such as intelligence, but group dynamics, so our ability to cooperate as a group, is really what's led us to dominate the planet. Human beings being intelligent by themselves, but not working with other people, leads to a dead human being. You're leopard food, no matter how clever you are. Human beings need groups to survive. Prosociality has evolved as this means for counteracting the individual capacity for aggression and dominance. And in fact, there's lots of scientific evidence out there which talks about how prosociality, both in modern society and amongst hunter-gatherer groups, is a means of gaining social status. So for example, hunters and hunter-gatherer societies who share more food with others gain more social status. Hunters who try to bully or attack others and are seen as overly aggressive get expelled from the hunter-gatherer group and presumably die. So the idea that social status does not in fact come from dominance and aggression but comes from prosociality is a repeatedly proven scientific construct. I know that this might sound a bit political. You might be thinking over here, well, this guy's biased. This guy's he's being woke. He's being politically partisan. He's trying to disprove this ideology because he's got an agenda to push. I promise you, I'm not trying to push an agenda on you. I'm just relaying scientific studies. And if you disagree with me, that's good. That's great. Go and do your own research. On this show, I don't want to try and tell you how to think. I don't want to try and push you towards a particular ideology. I don't want to spoon feed you anything. I want to encourage critical thinking and you getting your own information. But the crucial thing to note here is get your information from scientific articles. So whatever question you want to type into Google, type that in and then write journal article. Because that way, you're getting real information based on actual evidence. Because if you don't do that, you get influencers and you get articles which just say things at you with no evidence. It's just their opinions presented as fact. That's meaningless to you. That doesn't do anything for you. Go and look at actual scientific studies. And if you want to prove me wrong, go and prove me wrong. But just look at actual scientific studies. However, all of this that I've just mentioned doesn't capture the fact that in fact, if you don't stand up for yourself, and if you do let other people trample over you, you will have a worse life, and you will tend to be disrespected by others. That's not wrong. But the key thing to talk about here is that there's a difference between assertiveness and aggression. So just as I mentioned that pro-sociality is universally important for social status, so is assertiveness. So assertiveness is standing up for yourself in a non-aggressive way. Assertiveness is standing up for yourself in a way that isn't at odds with pro-sociality. And the Nice Guys Finish Last worldview doesn't make that nuanced distinction between assertiveness and aggression, because aggression is not good for social status. Assertiveness is. Aggression entails you standing up for yourself, but it comes at the cost of pro-sociality, so it's not good for social status. Again, if you disagree with me, go and look up scientific articles. Just make sure you're looking at scientific articles. Google search journal article after whatever question or statement you want to put in there. So now we've looked at social status, let's now look at attractiveness. What is it that heterosexual women look for in men? Again, we've also studied this. There's also actual scientific evidence about this. You don't need to take an influencer's word for it. And in fact, what repeatedly crops up in the literature is that heterosexual women find pro-sociality and altruism attractive. This makes complete sense because both of these evolved as means to get groups to work together. So it's completely unsurprising that attractiveness, another psychological mechanism, evolved to support these two dynamics because evolution is trying to get you to cooperate with each other. So other evidence, so actual scientific evidence, has shown that men who behave in a more altruistic manner get more attention from the other sex, more compliments, more attraction, are seen as more desirable, have more sexual partners, and date more people as well. There's also, so if we look at game theory, which is the application of mathematics to modeling behavior, there's also been lots of game theory simulations and tournaments where different behavioral strategies have competed against each other in sort of games like the Prisoner's Dilemma, for example. And what's repeatedly shown in these tournaments is that being willing to cooperate with people whilst also standing up for yourself, so pro-sociality and assertiveness, leads to the greatest utility for the player. So not only does this pro-sociality assertiveness stuff, not only has that been validated by scientific evidence, but mathematical simulations, which you can go and look up, by the way. Just look up Axelrod tournaments, Axelrod. It works as well. And I'm going to talk about this more specifically in a future episode of Polymath, because this application of game theory and mathematics to human behavior is fascinating. So that will be its own episode. But the point to mention right now is, this is all mathematically validated as well. And finally, a lot of it is kind of just common sense. Women are human beings. Human beings like it when they're treated nicely. They like it when people treat others nicely. So for example, if you're at school, you don't like the person who's the bully. When in general, in your workplace, you don't like people who are rude and aggressive to other people. That is just a fact of human nature. Women are human beings and are also, shockingly, and are also subject to human nature. And you know, I say shockingly sarcastically, I say this is obvious, but in fact, a lot of these male-dominated spaces, such as the manosphere online, tend to also be quite misogynistic places. And they tend not to afford women the same sort of dignity and respect with which they afford to men. They tend to judge men and women by very different categories. I know, again, that all sounds a bit politically partisan, and if you disagree with that, that's fine. I'm not telling you what to think. I've talked a little bit more about that in episode 29 of Polymath, so if you want an explanation of that, you can go and check that out if you want. But the point is, a subculture which treats men and women differently is pretty obviously going to be predisposed to seeing them as wanting different things. However, the vital conclusion, the vital obvious fact to state is that men and women are both human beings. And if you look scientifically at actual differences between men and women, there are some differences between men and women, but they tend to be very small. Men and women on average, averaged across thousands of different participants, do show slight differences. But these aren't big differences. In reality, men and women are way, way more similar than they are different. You can go and look that up, by the way. Just Google search gender similarity hypothesis journal article. I know that says hypothesis in the title, but it's backed by the recent evidence and recent scientific experimentation. The point is, both men and women like niceness. They like when they're treated nicely, they like it when other people are nice to them. And that they like it when other people are nice to others. And crucially, the final overwhelming conclusion, the overarching conclusion that I want to enforce in this video is that if you want to understand truths about human nature, and if you want to gain guides to behavior, do not take the word of random people online with a political axe to grind, because they're not going to give you real information. If you want real information, you need it to be based on actual evidence. You need to look at scientific, academic publications and conclusions. Remember, these influencers in male-dominated spaces, if they cite science, they're using it to prove their political point. They're not starting by surveying the evidence and then seeing what worldview that brings them to. They're starting with a worldview, they're starting with particular beliefs, and they're selectively using science as a way to prove them. So, first of all, they often don't do it correctly. So the whole alpha-beta typology thing comes from wolves. That's not real. Wolves don't actually act like that. Wolves in captivity tend to align themselves more on dominance hierarchies, but actual wolves, if you just study wolf behavior, rather than just getting loads of random wolves and imprisoning them in a cage with strangers. So you wouldn't gain your conclusions about human nature from people in jail. People normally, and wolves normally, organize themselves in families. And although the parents in families, the vaunted alpha male or alpha female, may exercise leadership, that's just because they're parents. In a human family, you don't call the dad the alpha male and the mum the alpha female. They're just the parents. So that whole alpha beta wolf thing, which was a sort of an appropriation of a debunked scientific study that these influencers used, that's not even based on real science. But the crucial thing is, don't get your opinions from people who are using science selectively to prove a point with an axe to grind. Get your opinions from real, unbiased science, straight from the source. That's all that I want to say. Thank you so much for listening. I really hope that was useful and informative, and I hope you have a lovely day. Take care.